In 1981, in the attic of a small terraced house in Sheffield, the center of the climbing community in the UK, Rab Carrington made the first sleeping bag to bear his name. More than 40 years later, the people at Rab are still crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment for the mountains, the kind of gear that becomes a staple in your kit that you'd rather repair than replace. Rab are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business and expand access to the outdoors. They're committed to preserving our mountain playgrounds for future generations because they know that the mountains are our meeting place. This episode is brought to you by Tension Climbing, training and performance equipment built with improvement in mind. Use code WRITTEN15 for 15% off of select items. The exposure was startling. The wind whipped around her threateningly, and she reconsidered her position. What am I even doing up here? Even though she'd been way off the ground before, she'd climbed El Cap a couple of times already, she couldn't ignore the view. This was the most exposed she'd ever been. At double the height of the captain, she was quite literally in the clouds. But the sound of a roaring fire below her was unsettling. So as she'd done so many times before, she turned to the climb before her and blocked everything else out. The view in her peripherals blurred. The rushing wind and roaring fire were muted. She focused, breathed, one handhold and one foothold at a time. It was as nervous as she'd ever been, and she could only hold the focus for a handful of moves before she had to reset. A nearby helicopter chopped incessantly as she ascended. It was unnerving, of course, but she paused gingerly and waved to the cameraman in the helicopter. It was a scary moment, but it made the up-and-coming superstar climber, Lynn Hill, feel like she was on top of a feather, drifting in the wind. Gradually, she grew more confident, finding a groove and sinking into a rhythm. Finding a groove and sinking in both figuratively and literally. See, each time she stepped up, her tiny frame disappeared into the collapsing folds of the giant hot air balloon she was clinging to the side of, 6,000 feet above the ground. Yeah, you heard that right. A hot air balloon. As she summited the balloon, she hurriedly made her way across and down the other side, ending the full circle journey with a campus move back into the basket. She sighed in relief, grateful she hadn't needed to use the parachute on her back after all. Lynn gave the pilot a nod, and they slowly sank back to earth. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, climbing's most important ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
In June of 1980, Lynn Hill bought a Volkswagen van. She and then boyfriend John Long, by that point veritable bedrocks of the unruly California climbers known as the Stonemasters, were ready to test their mettle elsewhere, particularly on unclimbed cracks they'd heard about. They headed east, first stopping just a few hours from their usual winter haunt of Joshua Tree at Granite Mountain in Arizona. Here they knew of an old 5-pitch aid line, Cotamundi Whiteout, first done in 1971 as mixed free and aid. Most of the route had been freed since, but a roof near the top had thus far stopped everyone cold. And with years in their pocket of climbing on the polished Yosemite granite cracks, the roof, which went at 5'11", barely even slowed John and Lynn down. From there, they headed to Colorado, setting up camp in Telluride for the summer, where they would be starting a guide service in collaboration with Royal Robbins. Royal had coaxed them into it with the promise of one of the best unfree-climbed cracks he'd ever seen, at a popular alpine rhyolite crag called the Ophir Wall. Named Lankies, an eponymous portmanteau of the first 8 Ascensionist names, Dan Langmaid and Bill Keys, the crack truly is spectacular. In 2000, John Long described it as a laser splitter up a glacier-polished wall from pinky locks to fist jams at the top. It's one of the great ones, as good as Yosemite's best. And the guide service Robbins was starting had a severe lack of clients, leaving Long and Hill with an excess of free time. So they went to work on the splitter. Lynn was stopped almost immediately by a Long move that didn't even seem possible for her 5'2" frame. Long, at over 6 feet tall, hadn't even recognized it as a challenging move. While Lynn worked out the low boulder problem, John pushed the gear higher and higher up the crack. However, as rock climbs often tend to be equalizers, the size of the crack up higher didn't favor Long's boxing glove-sized hands, and he was having trouble there. Sensing that he was probably close to the first ascent if he could just make it through that thin section of crack, the two returned with David Brashears, who was just starting his career as a filmmaker and was shooting a commercial at the Ophir Wall. By this time, Lynn had worked out the subtleties of the opening boulder. In her book Live Free, she writes, "I proceeded to set both my feet up high onto 2 small edges. Then I popped my hand up to the tiny crystalline edge for just long enough to still myself and find that perfect zero-gravity moment that exists somewhere between falling and jumping higher. Once I latched onto this hold, I was able to reach the thin crack and continued jamming to the top." This was a major breakthrough for Lynn. Her climbing had largely been overshadowed by her male partners, but this time, she had proved that she was equal, if not better. At 12 plus, it was one of the hardest routes anywhere and required Lynn to find improbable beta all her own, which boosted her confidence in finding such solutions moving forward. The big lesson for me here was to realize that despite what appeared to be a limitation due to my small stature, I could create my own method of getting past a difficult section of rock. I realized that no matter physical differences, with the right combination of vision, desire, and effort, just about any climb was possible. They renamed the newly freed line Ophir Broke, a play on the phrase go for broke, but also a double entendre of sorts. The nearby mining town of Ophir, like many across the Mountain West, had been named for a mythical African gold, and like most of those towns, had undergone its own boom and bust cycles. Ophir Broke would become one of the most sought-after, mythical cracks in the country. And now I'm going to step outside of the story for a second here, because there's a part of what I've read for research that bugs me. I found numerous sources that cite Lynn's small hands as the reason she was able to do Ophir Broke before the men who had tried it. But only one resource, Climb, the History of Rock Climbing in Colorado, mentions the boulder problem Lynn had to sort out at the bottom that John Long and many other men could just reach past. Sure, hand size matters. Of course it does, but so do all other bodily dimensions. Obviously, in retrospect, we can recognize that Lynn is just one of the best climbers ever. But come on, we can do better. In fact, John Long, in 2004, wrote this. Lynn Hill. We called her Little Lenny. She was a prodigy, and everyone knew as much. She carried her gift with quiet ease rather than chest-pounding or feigned all-shucks humility. 20 years ago, no female had ever climbed remotely as well as the best guys, so when Lynn began dusting us off, which she did with maddening frequency, folks offered up all kinds of fatuous explanations. Some diehards refused to believe a woman, and a 5-foot article at that, could possibly be so good. Out at Josh, it was said Lynn shone owing to quartzite monzonite's superior friction, which catered to her bantam weight. In Yosemite, her success apparently hinged on midget hands, which fit wonderfully into the infernal thin cracks. On limestone, she could plug 3 fingers into pockets where the rest of us managed 2. In the desert southwest, she enjoyed an alliance with coyotes or maybe shapeshifters. Even after a heap of World Cup victories, it still took the climbing world an age to accept Lynn as the chosen one, and perhaps her legacy was never established, once and for all, till she free climbed the nose. From the early days in Red Rocks, it would take her several years to become the Lynn Hill. Nevertheless, she was always a supernova, especially on that funky pitch way up what would become the seminal Levitation 29. Which is, of course, where we're headed next. I've got a confession to make. I've been climbing for nearly 30 years, and until a year ago, I'd never bought a piece of technical outdoor clothing. Maybe a raincoat 15 years ago and a puffy or two, but otherwise, nothing. But as I got back into sport climbing to try and finish 105.13s by my 50th birthday, I discovered that the cold winter winds of Wyoming that seemed to pick up force across the face of the crag and concentrate right on me were just too much for my usual hoodies. So I went shopping. And it takes a real event to force me to go shopping. I came home with a mid-layer that I thought I'd be able to climb in, but also might keep me from freezing up there, and I quickly discovered that the Rab Ascender light hoodie was long enough to fit easily under my harness, slim and stretchy enough to feel like it wasn't there, and had a hood that fit snugly enough on my head and neck that the wind didn't get in, and I didn't even notice the zipper. Since then, there hasn't been a single crag day that it wasn't with me. Now, I'm looking for other Rab layers that might make my experience even better. The Modulus hoodie and the Cirrus Flex insulated jacket, to be precise. And like I said, it takes a real event to make me go shopping. Rab. The mountains are our meeting place. The Telluride summer trip was ending, and as temperatures cooled, Lynn steered the van toward the deserts of Las Vegas, where she and John rented a ramshackle place just minutes from Red Rocks and worked whatever jobs they could get their hands on to fund their climbing. A few blocks from them lived another climber couple, Joanne and George Uriasti. The Uriastis met in New York climbing in the Gunks and had traveled the country climbing classic mountain routes in the Sierras, the Tetons, and anywhere they could find a big challenge. In 1974, they settled in Vegas and began exploring the huge sandstone walls just 20 miles from the Strip. Over the years, they'd become some of the most prolific of the small band of Vegas climbers at the time, establishing many now classic routes. But it wasn't all roses. Many of the locals were put off by the style with which they approached their new routes. See, even though the soft sandstone was covered in in-cut, patina-hardened holds, most climbers just stuck to the protectable cracks, the obvious lines. An anthropology professor at UNLV, George Uriasti saw lines in a different way. He was looking at big, seemingly unprotectable faces. And he'd aid these faces, installing bolts along the way, drilling them all by hand. Sometimes this would require months of work and dozens of bolts on a single 500 or 600 foot route. Joanne would follow behind, working out how to free the moves. When the preparation was done, Joanne would return with a different free climbing partner to redpoint the route. The Uriastis had been working on a new route way back in Oak Creek Canyon, high above the approach slabs and marked by a giant patinaed eagle stretching its wings across the face and flying westward. Joanne invited John and Lynn to join her for what she hoped would be a possible free ascent. Knowing that the cruxes were going to be hard, Joanne handed the lead over to Lynn. As Lynn led through the bolt-protected cruxes up the 700-foot wall, she was aware that she was climbing on a tightrope between two worlds. One holding on to the traditional rules of the past, rules that rewarded boldness and danger, and another that disregarded many of these rules, opting instead to design their own game, one with less jeopardy. George could bolt without shame. Joanne could work out the moves. They climbed because they loved climbing and having their own adventures, not to get stuck trying to follow the traditional norms. Lynn, Joanne, and John finished the route, named Levitation 29 because it was Joanne's 29th birthday. John and Lynn both knew that they had blurred the lines held so dear in Yosemite Valley and Joshua Tree. But they walked away feeling like they'd had a real adventure nonetheless, and had contributed to one of the most classic and most climbed long routes in the country. Their minds were swirling, conflicted, confused, but also inspired by the possibilities. It was becoming clear that the odd jobs they'd found in Vegas weren't paying nearly enough to justify staying through the heat of the summer, so when Long got a call about some TV opportunities, he and Lynn agreed to head back west and try their hand at Hollywood. Which brings us back to that hot air balloon. Lynn, along with many climbers at the time, was already a regular and successful competitor on a television show called Survival of the Fittest, an obstacle course-style race put on by NBC's Wide World of Sports. And she'd been offered spots on several other shows as a result of her success. John Long, becoming acutely aware that the full-time climber life wasn't exactly the best setup for other aspects of life, had a vision for the two of them. A life financed by action-packed television, Hollywood stunts, and more. They could still climb nearly full-time and maybe save some money in the process. Both were competitive and could put on a show, and it certainly didn't sound like his worst idea. However, by the time Lynn found herself climbing up and over the hot air balloon 6,000 feet in the air for a spot on That's Incredible, the Hollywood shine was starting to dull. The stunts were getting silly. John had just made the world's longest rappel to the ground from a helicopter, and Lynn agreed to zipline from yet another hot air balloon into a helicopter. She also tried learning the art of stunt falls into big airbags and attempted to audition for a commercial or two. But every time she was swallowed by those airbags or sank into the folds of a hot air balloon with cameras trained on her, her heart sank as well. Money from occasional stunts and my part-time job was enough to pay the bills of my college tuition, but my flirtation with Hollywood was beginning to feel demeaning. Her Survival of the Fittest wins proved to be her most reliable source of income, and if only for that reason, she kept up her appearances for a while, winning the title every year from 1980 to 1984. But she and John and their life together in Hollywood were at a crossroads, and Lynn knew it. It was time for a change. Or maybe several changes. In 1983, at the same time that John got an invitation to a 3-month project out of the country, Lynn got an invitation to New York for a magazine article. A paid ticket to the opposite coast and one of the country's premier trad climbing areas, the Gunks, sounded like as good an opportunity as any. And she and Long tearfully agreed to part ways romantically, but to maintain a friendship, and Lynn flew to New York. She'd heard the hype, of course, but what Lynn found at the Gunks, she would eventually describe as a trad climber's paradise. The quartz conglomerate was riddled with horizontal cracks and sharp crystals, varying dramatically from sheer faces to stunning overhangs that cut impressive outlines against the sky. After so many years of climbing anything and everything she could get her hands and feet on, Lynn had built up a massive library of experience to pull from. Not just the hardest or highest grades, but the countless reps on all sorts of rock in all sorts of styles and at all levels of difficulty. She'd done just enough to know that there was more to do, more to experience, more to learn. And so, guided by Russ Raffa and a few other locals, Lynn leaned into the challenge of learning an entirely new climbing area. Maybe it was the rock, which she described as the best she's climbed on. Maybe it was the change of scenery and community at a pivotal time in her life. Maybe it was all of the unclimbed routes, or maybe it was Russ Raffa, who she would spend most of the next decade with. But regardless of whether it was one or all of these things, she enjoyed it so much that when her return flight landed in California, she packed up her Volkswagen van and headed right back to New Paltz and the Gunks. You care about your climbing, right? Of course you do. Then you owe it to yourself to provide the best options for improving. And when it comes to training equipment and boards, that means tension climbing. The Tension Board 2 isn't just a bunch of holds scattered randomly on a board. Those days are history. This board is intentionally designed to help you become a better climber faster by people who actually use the board every day. You owe it to yourself. There's just no substitute. Use the code WRITTEN15 at checkout for 15% off of select goods. tensionclimbing.com. Mastery over success. Lynn Hill loved a physical challenge, and she found that in Gunks climbing. But with her breadth of experience, the learning curve was relatively short and sweet. Instead, it was the mental difficulty of the area that impressed her more than anything else. The Gunks was, and remains still to this day, a largely bolt-free zone. In the late 1970s and early 80s, this relatively small area was one of the world's leading forces in free climbing. Partly because they had a bit of a head start, a cheat code maybe, that can be traced back to the impact of two climbers in particular. First was the legendary Fritz Weissner, who had immigrated to New York from Dresden, Germany, where aid climbing had never really taken hold, and the official rules of free climbing had been in place since 1910. Credited with being the first modern climber to discover the Gunks in 1935, he immediately began free climbing the obvious lines, and along with partner Hans Kraus, established many of the classics, including the famous high exposure. The next major shift came in the 1960s by way of an introverted physicist named John Stannard. In 1967, he did the first ascent of the iconic roof of Fuchs, which is likely the first 511, and 11C at that, even though he called it 10+, but it's how he did Fuchs that would have the biggest impact. Through multiple falls and multiple attempts spread out over weeks, he completely flipped on its head the idea that if you can't do it first try, you just can't do it. And he would also go on to be one of the first climbers in the country to champion the idea of climbing clean, without pitons. With this kind of provenance and reliance on free climbing baked into the very genesis of the climbing in the Gunks, it was destined to be a leader in that movement. But while Lynn's experience in gunning for FAs elsewhere had mostly hinged on navigating the physical moves of routes, here in the Gunks, Lynn quickly found the biggest challenge for would-be free climbers was the decision to risk climbing through sections of rock with limited protection, or, just as often, no protection at all. Sure, it benefited to be a strong climber, but there were plenty of strong climbers around. Here, it was the bold who won the day. With that in mind, Lynn set to mastering the style of the area. 10s and below proved to be of little challenge, but set her up well for the 11s, which tested her mental mettle, but tended to go down in a try or two. Where she would really shine was when faced with the unknown, a grade that was challenging, moves that had yet to be unlocked, and protection that may or may not actually have the ability to protect. Many of the area's best climbers were spending time searching for that next best, next hardest line. Supercrack had already become famous, and they were looking for something that might make the same kind of statement. It was Jeff Gruenberg and Jack Mileski who found it. A vertical face followed by a big roof split by a crack. They immediately recognized that it would not only be hard, but that the start would be largely unprotectable. As they arranged the talus in big blocks littering the area below the climb, Jack realized what they should call it. Vandals, named for their minor ethical infraction of improving the landing zone. Turns out, even in an ethical stronghold, there are climbers who are willing to push some boundaries. Climbers whose rules aren't necessarily immutable. Thank goodness for that. According to Russ Clune in his book The Lifer, he happened along just as the pair finished clearing the ankle-breaking blocks and started on the route. He joined in to try the bottom of the route with its awkward, difficult moves, and after several attempts, they'd only gotten 10 feet off the ground, where they'd placed a couple of sky hooks on small flakes. The committing move above those hooks was just too much. Nobody wanted to be the one to test those sky hooks. And then, Lynn Hill walked around the corner. As she suspiciously eyed the bizarre scene, 2 ropes, a couple of sky hooks 10 feet up, and all 3 men standing there staring up at a big roof way above their obvious high point, she had questions. The guys did their best to answer those questions while still maintaining some semblance of coolness. Yeah, this is a new line. No, we haven't been any higher than that. Yeah, we think this system will be safe. Well, no, none of us have actually been brave enough to test it yet. But they all had the same idea. Lynn was the lightest of them by far, so maybe she would be willing to try the move and test the system. Lynn, with her robust climbing experience, bottomless confidence, and newfound Gunks-style boldness, tied in and immediately fired the boulder problem none of these guys wanted to commit to. Easier climbing led her to a ledge at about 20 feet where she was able to fiddle in a couple of nuts, the first real protection on the route. Above this point, the wall bulged out for a few body lengths before it met the 15-foot roof, split by a jagged, intimidating crack. The path to that roof didn't seem clear, with no protection in sight. Lynn tried a few things, but got nowhere, and eventually returned to the ground so that someone else could try. Clune was up next. In the lifer, he writes, "On my turn, I made the moves to the roof only to find myself with one hand on a fingertip edge and my feet pasted to crappy footholds. I focused on a small crack at eye level, trying to make a nut, any nut, stick in the damn thing. Nothing fit, and my fingers began to wilt. I looked down between my legs for a moment to check how far it was to those last nuts. Shit, I muttered to myself before I yelled at Jeff, who was belaying me. I'm off." The nuts held Clune's big, ankle-twisting screamer, but the adrenaline from the momentum they'd created kept any pain at bay. Jeff nervously roped up. Knowing where to go now, he top-roped back to the nuts Lynn placed and sprinted through the bulge to the base of the roof. He held on long enough to fiddle in the small gear that Russ couldn't get in, and then flaming out, gave a tentative, take? Russ gently took in the slack, hoping the nuts would hold. Jeff held his breath while he lowered, feeling a little like he'd gotten away with something. But now the team could get to work on the big roof. Now let's remember, this was 1983. The ethic of the day to claim a valid ascent was the yo-yo. One climber went up as high as they could. When they fell off, they lowered off. No previewing what was coming. The next person got to top rope to that highest piece of gear and try to continue from there. And there were all sorts of opinions as to why the yo-yo method was easier or harder or more adventurous or removed some of the challenge. And all of those opinions are probably right. But one thing that can't really be debated is that in situations like this, where several climbers at a similar ability level were all trying a new route, the yo-yo promoted incredible teamwork, partnership, and camaraderie. Each team member makes valuable contributions that eventually leads to someone doing the route. I discussed this in Season 1 when it came to big wall free climbing, but it applies here as well. Many of the hardest routes of the 1980s were a product of several climbers, all contributing to an eventual send that, sadly, often gets credited to just one name. Walking out that first day, the team of 4 discussed the route, and of course, the difficulty. What they'd climbed was already scary 511, and it was certainly about to get way harder. But how hard? Time would tell. Well, as much as anyone can tell anything when it comes to grades. Jack Molesky was moving back to Texas, so his spot on the team was filled by Hugh Herr, who was one of the first child prodigy climbers and who, just a year earlier at 17, had gotten caught in a blizzard and due to frostbite, lost both legs below the knee. Incredibly intelligent and strong-willed, Hugh defied the doctors, got himself back into climbing shape, and had already begun experimenting with prosthetic limbs that would allow him to climb at his previous levels, or above. And over the next several weeks, the crew sporadically made their way out to Vandals to chip away, metaphorically of course, at the strange and awkward moves across the big roof. They were persistent, bolstered by each other's boldness, borrowing beta, and closing in on what they now suspected would be the hardest route in the area. One by one, they sorted the contorted sequence through the roof, finding a good cam placement, a tool that was still relatively new, about 2/3 of the way out. The 3 men with more reach had found their way across the roof to the lip, where they were being consistently rejected. After falling for the umpteenth time at the same spot in the roof, Lynn was getting a little frustrated. She asked her belayer if he could hold her there for a moment. The unwritten rules were clear. No hangdogging. You fall, you come back down. Try it from the beginning. No exceptions. But through her time in Vegas, she'd seen that bending the rules could lead to better results, more fun, without necessarily sacrificing the adventure. These rules were all arbitrary anyway, made up by someone long ago to fit their situation and their own perception of what climbing should be. Why couldn't she just make her own rules to fit her own perception? Hanging from the rope, she reached up and began searching, feeling around for any subtlety in the rock that she might be able to find purchase on. Moments later, her eyes lit up. She'd found a hidden hold that would almost certainly allow her to make the moves. Suddenly, this section had gone from damn near impossible to a real fighting chance. A few years later, she'd be grilled about these tactics at the Great Debate, a discussion between the traditional holdouts and more progressive climbers hosted by the American Alpine Club. She'd stand firm in her beliefs, as she'd do many times throughout her career. But the Great Debate is another story entirely. On this day, at Vandals, it was different. They were pushing into new territory, a new level. It could possibly be 513, a still mythical grade. One that, thus far, everywhere it had been done, required a rethinking of the rules of the game. Ray Jardine had worked the Phoenix in sections, employing an entirely new tool, camming devices. Tony Yaniro had hung on the rope and created a replica of Grand Illusion. Jeff and Jack had cleared the landing below Vandals, so the whole thing had started with an infraction. Hugh Herr was thinking forward and innovating specific prosthetics to make the moves work for him. Nobody in this team was at all bothered by Lynn hanging on the rope to check out her options. And this was all about the team. Shortly after, Russ Clune somehow managed to contort his long, lanky frame into the necessary positions needed to mantle over the awkward lip of the roof. Standing there, victorious, the finishing ledge at eye level, he leaned back slightly and was off. Giant flake, still in his hands, screaming, "No!" all the way until he felt the rope catch. Maybe a little longer. I can only imagine the anguish. But they were now positive that it could be done. Over a 2-day period in late October 1983, the hard work of these 4 teammates, partners, friends, paid off. They each sent, in turn, one after the other. The hardest route in the Gunks. The hardest route in the East, actually. The hardest route done by an amputee, and the hardest route in the world climbed by a woman. Lynn Hill.
2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. If you haven't read the 2 books we used for most of the research in this episode, Lynn Hill's Climbing Free or Russ Clune's The Lifer, go do it. We're going to give away a few copies of The Lifer to our patrons, and you can enter that drawing for absolutely free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know, at the crag, at the gym, in that internet forum where everyone is shouting into the void, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, 1 decade at a time. Secret Stoners. I know some of you listening right now are like, oh my God, what did I just stumble into? This is the Secret Stoners Club, and you too can become a Secret Stoner at patreon.com/Secret Stoners Club, where you get bonus episodes, bonus materials, things I find in my research, etc., as well as a bunch of giveaways. And I have news on those giveaways. I have chosen the winners of the Alan Watts posters, and I left that notebook in my car, and there's several feet of snow outside, and it's 10 degrees below zero. And it's 9 o'clock at night, so I'm not going out there right now. But I will have those posted up in the Patreon, and I will have them on next week's episode as well. I also have the next items for giveaway, which you'll also learn about next week. And I'm working on a big giveaway with Rab. So, lots of giveaways coming. If you're not a Secret Stoner already, go do it. The link's right there in your show notes as well. Big thanks to Andrew and Amy, our newest rock stars. I appreciate you as always. I've also got some very cool bonus episodes coming down the pipeline. Just more things I'm finding in my research right now. We're kind of making these as they're coming out. I don't have a bunch in the tuck already. So I don't have tons of time to make big bonus episodes, but I have lots of ideas that I'm coming across, and I have great essays that I'm coming across in my research. And Alan Watts has recently sent me some incredible things that I can't wait to tell you about later this season when they become really pertinent. Also, this episode was the first episode of the season that Riley wrote the rough draft for. Pretty much all of her rough draft made it in some way with my edits, and then I added maybe 50% more to fill this episode out and connect some dots. But one thing she had was the hot air balloon intro. And I don't know if any of you at work or in your hobbies or whatever ever just do something that makes you feel like a genius and you just hope other people notice it. Well, I'm going past hoping other people notice it, and I'm just going to tell you about it because I felt like a genius when this all came together. I was making the music for that hot air balloon section, and there's a moment where the big reveal happens that she's on a hot air balloon, and the music, it's like the music dies right there, and then there's a hot air balloon sound, the sound of the flame that's inflating the hot air balloon, and the music reinflates at the same time as that sound. I am a genius. I know some of you have felt that, whether you're a carpenter or an engineer or a coder or a chef, whatever it is, you felt like a genius. Tell people about it. We all want to know. Thank you for indulging that. Some of the things I did add into this episode, I had a lot of fun sorting out. And there are pieces I want to explore further in the future. But as all of you know, since season 1, I've been sort of obsessed with trying to connect dots and draw through lines through all of these things. And I'm starting to see that the building blocks of free climbing, red pointing as we know it now, came into existence in a lot of different places at around the same time, and some pieces were being rejected, continued to be rejected. Some were immediately embraced. And as I interview more and more people, I'm hearing more stories that I find really interesting. And that's I'm going on tangents here, but that's what we do, right? That's what we do in the Secret Stoners Club. One of the things I'm liking about this season versus last season is that I'm doing most of my interviews ahead of time. So I'm getting the interviews done before I'm even finished with the episodes. So I get to add in some pieces that I've learned in those interviews. For instance, this episode, pieces of the Vandals story, the John Stannard connection in the Gunks and how he was instrumental in making free climbing as big as it was, and making the Gunks the sort of free climbing powerhouse that it was in the 80s, that came from the interviews that I did that you all will be hearing next week. And similar things have happened in, future episodes that are coming and in the episodes I've already done, that I've learned things along the way that I didn't find in my research that no one else has just connected dots through. They haven't drawn a line through these things. And hearing them from people who were there or who were inspired by or who were friends of, then I get to draw that line through it. That's been really incredible. That was totally a tangent. And I don't have the first clue where I was. The nice thing is it's recorded, but I'm not going to go back and listen to that recording. We just go here in the Secret Stoners Club. Oh yeah, I remember where I was. The influence of climbing in Red Rock and, the way the rock sort of influenced how the Uriostes were putting up roots. And then I found this essay by John Long talking about seeing the beginnings of sport climbing happening right there in the early 80s in Red Rocks, and how they could still have these almost big wall adventures, but on sport climbs. And that really surprised him. So I added that piece in, and then taking a look at the Gunks and how it's a traditional area, but it's also very, very modern. And that'll get explained in a future interview episode as well. But drawing the through lines through there into what becomes full-fledged sport climbing in the U.S. is really interesting. We heard talking with Gibet and Arnoux that the Belgians were doing this in yellow that was prior to red pointing, communicating the same way with colors of paint, so that people who came next knew what had happened. And that there was this free climbing going on in Eastern Germany that was a little different. They were allowed to hang on bolts and then continue free climbing. So closer to hang dogging. They were just not sending the whole thing in one go. But those things got combined eventually. All these ethics and all these pieces coming from different places, and people like Alan Watts taking what they had available at Smith and finding a way to continue challenging themselves. It's everyone working together to create this thing. It's not Kurt Albert invented the red point and we all just started following it. It's not how it went down, even though that's how history would have us believe that it went down. So I'm loving drawing these through lines and connecting these dots. So thank you all for sticking with me. And thanks to the folks who've sent really kind messages about this season and about the way I'm approaching this history. I appreciate the votes of confidence. I just go off on my own sometimes, and I never know what people are going to think about it. So I'm glad people are enjoying it. Coming up next week, that scene in Forrest Gump where Forrest is running? I was going to do the voice there, and then I decided not. Is that a cancelable offense these days to do the Forrest Gump voice? I'm not sure. Forrest is running, and he's running through major events in American history or world history. Next week, I'm talking to the climber who is the Forrest Gump of climbing. All right. I'll see you then.